Okay, so before I keep going with my story of changing careers and everything that I've done since then, I want to talk a little bit about why I sort of keep referring to rent and having a rent controlled apartment and housing. And it's because one of the things that I was really, really aware of during this time is the rate at which gentrification is happening in Los Angeles and in my neighborhood specifically, where it's really, really obvious to me. And I think that at this point in time, everyone is pretty aware that buying a house is completely out of reach for like entire generations. I am not millennial or Gen Z. I'm like the very end of Gen X. So I feel like this is so typical of what people say about Gen X, that you kind of feel like people just leave you out of these statistics, that you're kind of overlooked, and we are. But my personal experience is that I think everyone I know who's my age, and some people I knew who are younger than me who bought houses, only were able to do so because their parents helped them out with a down payment, or helped them pay property taxes every year, or some other way. I don't know a ton of people who have successfully bought their own houses who are sort of, I would consider, my peers. So there's that one thing. And if not that, again, not that this is not all pretty commonly known at this point, but if you want to read a really, really interesting book, interesting and infuriating book about gentrification. It's sort of case studies of a number of different American cities that have undergone gentrification. The book How to Kill a City will completely piss you off, but also give you a lot of insight into what has happened over the last, let's say, 20 years. The book is, again, How to Kill a City. The author is a journalist named Peter Moskowitz. That aside, while I am doing all of this stuff in my life and super aware of housing prices and housing instability, and that's the thing, is that when I was working at my job, and I think that a lot of people have heard this from employers and coworkers, one of the ways they kind of try to keep you in line is saying things like, you should be lucky you even have a job, especially during the recession. And, you know, when you are day to day living, seeing people pushed out onto the street, seeing people on the street with signs that say, my rent went up, and I can't pay it this month, help me pay my rent, which is a real thing that I would see in my neighborhood, and read stories about people's rents being raised really absurd amounts just overnight with like maybe a month's notice, maybe less. It makes you very aware of your housing situation and the precarity of it, and the situation in all of the country, really. So one of the things that I had started doing even before I had left my job or thought about leaving my job, was that I was always looking around for another city to live in, because I just felt like I discovered at some point that not everywhere is as expensive as Los Angeles. And I felt like maybe the best thing to do would be to find some place less expensive to live. And also, you know, just for a little bit of change and a little bit of adventure. I had only ever really lived in Los Angeles, and I wanted to see other parts of the country and of the world. And I wasn't really having that opportunity. I was working really hard just to live here. And I just, something that I have said over and over for years, and I've met other people who have said the same thing, and it's just, if you get it, you get it, and if you don't get it, please don't be offended. My attitude is that I did not agree to be born into this world, and I am super pissed off about all of the things that I am required to do to simply survive a life that I did not agree to enter. That does not mean that I don't want to be alive. I am here. I am still here. It does mean that capitalism sucks and it really pisses me off. And I really, really hate the attitude that I hear so often about, gratitude for being here, gratitude for being hired to a job or allowed to keep a job. I have value as well, and maybe someone should be grateful that I am here and that I am willing to work to make them more wealthy or to serve whatever purpose they're hiring me to do. That is also valuable, and I deserve to live without fear that I'm going to lose my home, without fear that if I stand up for myself, I will not be able to take care of myself. I should not have to trade, dignity basically for survival. That's really super unfair and a disgusting thing to say to anyone. And it's something that I feel like is almost not even, it's not abnormal to hear, and it's completely accepted by a lot of people, and it just pisses me off enormously. So I had been looking around at other places to live and doing so in just a variety of different ways. Like I definitely knew that I needed to live in a city. I like being in a place with a lot of diversity. I like being in a place that's very real. I'm not really into suburbs and quiet places. I love nature, but I think that I would go insane if I lived in a rural area. And the next part of that is sort of figuring out where would I be accepted, because I do have very, very left-leaning political views, and I don't like the idea at all of being surrounded by people who have very opposite political views and who maybe will completely hate me for what I believe is right. I also don't want to, I wouldn't have any friends in some place like that. I also can't imagine being able to endure like a Midwestern winter. I am from Los Angeles. I am addicted to sunshine. The days I get sad in the winter here, and it's not even that bad, I know. So I can't do that. That would really be bad for me. But that said, I had already kind of gone through a list of like, New York is too expensive. San Francisco was the first place I wanted to move to a long time before that. But by the time I was, again, really thinking seriously about moving, San Francisco at that point was also too expensive. I considered Portland briefly because it was very popular for a while, so it comes into your awareness. And it sounded like a fun place, but I hear that it's not very diverse, and the weather would probably be really hard for me. At some point, I want to say that two places that I did the most research into, one was Chicago, and I knew that ultimately that wasn't going to work out for me because the winters would be way too dramatic a change. But the people seem really lovely, and the city itself seems really lovely. So there's that. The one place that I got really, really into researching was Detroit, which, again, the weather is not going to work for me. But when I was looking into it, it was pre-revitalization. Like, Detroit was at absolute bottom, which is intriguing to me for some reason. And I was reading things about people being sort of like really pioneering. Also because knowing what I knew about the gentrification in Los Angeles, seeing houses get sold and flipped and sold again for like twice as much, and understanding the impact of that on anyone who might have originally been able to buy that house, and just the ridiculous arguments I've heard why it's acceptable. Detroit at that time had a lot of empty houses that people were not competing for. You could buy an empty house that was not in terrible condition for like $10,000 easily. You would be the only person living in that neighborhood. You would have no services, like no fire department, no trash pickup. That's a problem, obviously. But I also knew that that was not going to last forever. I don't know how change is going to happen there or when it's going to come, but I do know that that city isn't going to sit empty forever. And so the idea for me of going and buying a really cheap house for very little amount of money and then hanging on and becoming a part of a community that is being built, that sounded fascinating. But I also was reading stories of people buying really cheap houses and living in them and rebuilding them while they're living in them and dealing with like freezing temperatures all winter with no heat, and people trying to break into that house while you're living in it in the middle of the night to steal your wiring and things like that. And I am not quite that brave, unfortunately. But again, it sounds like an adventure. So I'm going through, basically what I'm saying is I'm going through all these American cities that are in a condition where I'm thinking there might be some advantage to moving to this deserted place and getting in early and setting myself up to be stable for the rest of my life, which is really all I'm trying to achieve at this point. Because living in Los Angeles during massive gentrification is very destabilizing. Whether or not you are really being impacted directly, you're still being impacted and seeing it happening to people all around you and seeing people living on the street. If you have an awareness that you are not untouchable, which none of us are, but a lot of people like to pretend that they are, then you know that you are not that far from being them. So this is why I'm kind of always referring to housing and having this rent control apartment that is like seriously a treasure. It's not the greatest apartment. It's in a really great spot, but it's like a prize to me because I know that I have advantages that I wouldn't otherwise have. So that's why I'm a little bit obsessed with housing. And that's also where the idea of moving out of the country started, is that I started initially thinking maybe I should leave Los Angeles. Maybe this isn't the place for me. Maybe it's too hard to live here. Where can I go? And over time, and especially as I learned more about the gentrification of different cities, a few years later, I read that book, How to Kill a City, and I read about the gentrification of Detroit. And one of the things that happens that is really, really heartbreaking is that people were buying up houses that had tax liens on them for like $5,000. Houses that had been in families for generations already, that someone was still living in, that were completely paid off, but everyone is on hard times and they've fallen behind on their property taxes. And suddenly buying a cheap house in Detroit actually feels kind of dirty and bad. Not that I had even convinced myself that I was going to do that or could do that. I was still struggling to get by here. When I was working at the first job, unemployment was still paying me whatever was the difference between what I was making each week at that salon and what they would have paid me if I was still unemployed. And when I quit that job, I actually lost the last week's worth of payments that I had still coming from unemployment because I quit that job not for a good enough reason for them. And so then they really did cut me off. I was very fortunate that while I was doing that, one of my neighbors who had been laid off due to the recession had started a dog walking and pet sitting business. And then she had found her way into something else, and she handed over all of her dog walking and pet sitting clients to me, which was very kind and generous of her. And that is what got me through like the first few years of working overall. And at some point when I was quitting jobs and in between, it was the only money I was making. And it was not a lot either. But it did the trick. It let me have just a little bit more freedom. And also at that point, I had just kind of gotten used to, I was like, I'm poor again. It's fine. I am managing to get by. When things got really, really desperate, I would like sell anything I had that was worth anything. I had this fantastic old card catalog, the many, many drawers, wooden card catalog from a library that I had bought years ago for like $200. I sold it for, I think, $1,000, or I think it was $1,000 to some guy who came and picked it up. That was it. I was just kind of like making everything work. I never, there's no magic to it. I didn't have secret money saved away that was making this all work. I was living on like not enough money. I was juggling again. I was selling anything I had that was worth anything. I have gotten bizarrely lucky that I will randomly have a book that's special and out of print, and I'll magically find someone who will buy it, not for a lot, but this is how I'm getting by. Now, somewhere in here, when I've kind of run out of American cities that seem like reasonable choices or interesting choices or choices that would accommodate my specific like climate needs, I start thinking about other countries, and not very seriously, not in a very organized way. My sister lives in France and has lived there for quite a long time at this point, and I think that is definitely part of why I'm thinking like I could just leave the country possibly. Like, it is possible. People do it, and she has done it. So at some point that becomes another thing that I'm thinking about. And my father is an immigrant from Poland. I'm thinking possibly I can get citizenship to Poland, but I don't really know how or where to start looking into that. But at some point, I just start thinking, the more I learn about the United States, the more I think about how it is sort of treating people and how it's functioning. And it's really brutal, honestly. There are just, and it seems almost as if there's no way to really have long-term stability unless you're super wealthy. And that's just not a likelihood for most people here. Unless you are born with significant advantages, you're probably going to struggle for possibly your entire life, and it's very uncomfortable, and it's making me very angry. Once again, I didn't agree to this, and I don't accept this culture, I guess, if that's what it is. That's making me unhappy and making my life difficult. And being aware of things like minimum wage not going up, and your pay, even if you're making better than minimum wage, not necessarily going up, but prices just doubling, and it's insane. Rents jumping up, gas prices for your required commute to work jumping up. It's just really difficult. And so even when I had what I considered a pretty good job, making really decent money, I was still struggling until the very last promotion that I got, which was the first time that I was comfortable. I had worked, which means I worked there for 11 years, struggling. It's, it's all really rude, to be honest. It's really offensive the way that everything works inside of a capitalist system, and inside the United States in particular, which is really the only country I can speak with any authority on. And even then, Los Angeles specifically, probably. Although it does sound like most of the United States is functioning kind of the same way. So that is my rant, and that is why I keep mentioning housing. It is a big link to a later part of my story, where I apply for citizenship in Poland and start planning a move to Italy, which is still way down the line from where we are now. I hope that you will stick around and find out what happens.